Good morning. You know, I don't know how it works, but there have been so many times in my ministry when there were ideas that I was mulling over, things that I'd been praying about, meditating on, maybe just some things that I was planning to deliver in a message, that in the midst of that week, there was a piece of information or something that came that was so fitting with the things I'd already been thinking about that I really believe that God is involved in it in some way. I don't know how he does it, but he does. Last week, I unwittingly brought out the second law of thermodynamics in my sermon to make a point about a scientist, an astrophysicist, who, if he's to take all of the information that he knows about the universe and the way that it functions and the way that it works, it should, he's got all these facts, but when you put all of them together, it points to a certain end that is inescapable. And if there is to be true understanding beyond just a mere comprehension of facts, then he's going to lean on that understanding. He's going to lean on those facts and then have understanding. Well, that second law of thermodynamics, I want to talk a little bit more about it today because somehow or another, it really, I think, serves to prove in a physical way a point that is very spiritual that Paul is getting at in Romans chapter 3. Now, if you want to go ahead and open up to Romans 3, beginning in verse 11 is where we're going to be this morning. You can turn there, but I want to talk a little bit more about that. I doubt there's anybody that just remembers the second law of thermodynamics off the top of their head from last week. But there's a number of different ways that you can state it, but maybe the simplest way of putting it is that energy becomes less useful over time. In other words, the overall level of entropy gets greater and greater and greater as time goes on. Entropy being a measure of disorder. So I want you to imagine a light bulb, and this thing has been on for 10 minutes. Well, all around that light bulb, the air molecules are heated, and they're a different temperature than everything else that's in static space, all around them. This is the second law of thermodynamics works this way. So you right here by this light bulb, you have the electricity going through that bulb, and it's emanating heat. It's warming the area. It's warming the air molecules right there. The heat in those molecules can't really be destroyed, but what it can do is it takes its energy and it just kind of brings it into everything else. And so as that heat moves outward, it mixes those hot air molecules with the cold air molecules. And eventually what was once a hot air molecule is no longer hot anymore because it has dispersed its energy really broadly. It's no longer there together. And one of the things that they understand in thermodynamics is the energy always moves from the hot to the cold. You don't extrapolate energy out of the cold and add it to the hot. It doesn't ever work that way. It starts warm, and then as time goes on, it disperses itself to the point where it brings itself into something that they call equilibrium, where all of the, it's all the same. It's just a static level of energy. Imagine being around a fire. The further you get from the fire, what was those once heated air molecules are no longer hot anymore. They've mixed with the cold, and now they're just like everything else. So I want you to just imagine that. This is something that, that might seem overly technical, but as I consider the Bible and spiritual relationships, in how they function in real life, it makes sense to me that when there is one God, when there is one mind behind the universe, that one God and that one mind is going to take principles and bring them into everything, into physical realities and even into spiritual realities. it doesn't surprise me that the things we observe scientifically under microscopes and in labs, you find applications even in the spiritual realm. And it doesn't surprise me because there's one mind that was behind all of it. So the second law of thermodynamics has some application to some things Paul is bringing out in Romans chapter 3. Now, the reason why I said that I think that this is what I thought was interesting this last week as I was preparing for the lesson, I brought that last week when I brought out those two laws. I didn't know that I was going to go any further with them. Had no idea that I would. But then when I'm reading the text, I see from Romans 3:11 and on, Paul keeps bringing out some things that kind of equate to that second law. And then a friend of mine sent me an article. And the article had to do with applying entropy to a spiritual walk of life, which again, the guy in this article was talking about how quickly disorder comes of things if you are not constantly working to bring order. There's nothing in your life that remains orderly for any period of time at all if you are not every day working to keep it ordered. There's something to this thing of entropy that if you let something just sit still, it's going to keep breaking down. If you never sweep your front porch, it's going to get dustier and dustier and dustier. And it doesn't matter if you dusted it yesterday, you have to do it again the next day. It doesn't matter how many times you shave your neck. The beard hair keeps coming back, and it's going to get messy if you don't clean it. Same thing with your yard and mowing. If you never clean it, things just move to seemingly a state of disorder if you're not constantly working at it. And I thought it was really interesting that the author, this theologian, used the word entropy, which I'd used in last week, which connected to what we were talking about today. So I don't think that this is by coincidence that these things are being brought out. So I want you to take that physical idea, bring it with you into Romans chapter 3 and verse 11. And I'll say this at the outset of the message. You remember beginning in right about verse 10, verse 11 there, Paul he's talking to the Jews, right? And since the beginning of this chapter, since the beginning of Romans 3, he's been having an argument with the Jews. It's been a debate back and forth. Was God faithful to his promises when the Jews to whom he promised eternal life were no better off than the Gentiles who didn't have those promises? Well, God said, let God be true, Paul said, let God be true, but every man a liar. And the idea here is God is always faithful. Man is always unfaithful. Now, further proving that point, what Paul has done in Romans 3:11 and following is he's strung together 8 verses from the Old Testament. He didn't just get one scripture. He got 8 verses and pieced them together, all of which prove this point to the Jew, that the Jew is just as damned as the Gentile. So he says, what's he say? None is right. This is the scripture from the Psalms. None is righteous. No, not one. None seeks God. Everyone has turned away. They have altogether become worthless. None does good, not even one. So he's piecing together all these verses to still prove this point. And the immediate application for you and me, as we're reading these things, is to realize Paul is building a case that we should not feel that by our own devices we have made ourselves righteous. We should not ever conceive of our walk with God as us being righteous. If we are to have righteousness, it will not be because of us. It will be because of God. Because as he says, none is righteous. This means there's no one in this room that is more worthy of salvation than anyone else in this room. all of us are unrighteous, and therefore all of us stand condemned, and therefore all of us need the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's his point through here. All we've done last week and this week is somewhat of a digression into the particulars of the verses that Paul quoted from the Old Testament, because there's some real spiritual insight in these verses that he brings out. We looked last week at just that one idea, there is none who understands. And I spent the whole message talking about what it means to not have understanding. Remember what it means? Well, it doesn't mean that you lack facts. Everybody has facts to an extent. Not having understanding is when you have the facts and they point to a conclusion that you're not willing to believe because it would demand something of you that you're not willing to do. So we looked at that. Now today, as I pointed out a moment ago, the rest of what I see here in this breakdown of these Old Testament verses is an exemplifying or a demonstration of this second law of thermodynamics. The way that godly energy and that all that we were made to be becomes less and less and less and less useful as we drift and get further and further and further from God, and there become more and more and more like the world, and there become unidentifiable as the people of God, which is what Paul is saying in Romans 3:11 and following. Now, I'll just ask you as we get into these verses, what would you expect of the person who has no understanding of the things of God? What would you expect by way of their virtue? What would you expect by way of the things they say? What would you expect by way of their conduct? What would you expect by way of their reasoning skills? A person who doesn't grasp the things of God, what would you expect of their moral state or the amount of wisdom that they possess and could give to you? I was thinking over that this week, and I think the answers to it are obvious. But as I was when I'm sitting back in my office, a lot of times, I get a little snippet of something I want to preach, and then I'll just preach it back there. And I'll sit in my office and I'll preach over this little section that I'm thinking, and I'm working through it out loud. And as I'm speaking, sometimes I'll say something that I wasn't even thinking about beforehand, and I'll quickly write it down because it's just what I needed. Well, this happened this week as I was doing this. I was preaching this little point, and then this verse just came out of my mouth that was somewhere deep in my subconscious and related in some way. And it was James chapter 3, verses 13 through 16. Let me read this. It says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" So different understanding, different Greek word than what's in Romans 3, verse 10 that we looked at last week, but very related. So still he's getting at the same point. Godly wisdom, having a good understanding of the universe. He's saying, who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Key word there at the end, disorder. So who has the wisdom and the understanding of God? On one hand, Well, let him show it in the meekness of wisdom, the wisdom that comes from above, which is first pure, then peaceable, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, as he says in James. But the person that is lacking that understanding, and by virtue of lacking wisdom from above and understanding from a godly perspective, that person, he says, maintains a wisdom that is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. And therefore, what does he say of the conduct in their life? It will be full of disorder and every vile practice. So you're getting an idea. As I think back to this thermodynamics, let me get kind of technical for a moment. Imagine that you have around this light bulb, each of these little particles has 40 joules of energy. And let's say that the average energy in the air around that is 5 joules of energy. You got this hot right here. As those things emanate their energy, as they continue to expand out, they're going to transfer their energy to the rest of this stuff. Over time, the 40 gets, there's no compact area that's any longer anything like that. It just becomes all one. When you think of disorder, that's why they call it entropy. Those little things, they just go everywhere. They mix with everything. They never will come back to a state of order again. It's impossible. Same thing in the spiritual world. When you're close to God and then you leave him, what happens? Disorder. So taking that perspective that Paul gives here in Romans 3, or excuse me, let's read what he says here in Romans 3. And I want to see if you can see that principle from James 3 at work. He says, there is no righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. Everyone turned away. They've altogether become worthless. There's none who does good, not even one. An open tomb is their larynx, using their words to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips, and their mouths are full of bitterness and cursing. Their feet are swift to bloodshed. Destruction and misery are in their path, and they've not known the way of peace. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Does that seem like the kind of disorder and every vile practice that James just spoke about in James chapter 3? That's a pretty good picture of it. Now, here's what we need to understand, Christians. Paul, in this spelling out of just the natural way things are going to go, it goes from bad to worse to progressively really bad in his example, which implies that there is more disorder, more susceptibility to vile practices the further and further you get from God in space and in time. The further you get from God, notice in this list, he talks about kind of one of the last things he mentions is their feet are swift to bloodshed and destruction and misery are in their path. Now, let me ask you, is that going to be the way that every single person who walks out of church is going to behave and act? Immediately swift to bloodshed, making misery and destruction to be in their path? Is that what happens? We've all seen people that have left the faith. Do they immediately go to murdering people? No, because they were just close to God. There's still some level of moral framework and conscience and stuff that's still keeping them together somewhat. But the point of Paul is that if you leave God and if you were given enough time, say you could live 500,000 years, I don't think there'd be a single person alive who wasn't a murderer if they didn't have God. It's progressive in the way that it goes. And the thing that astounds me as I think over this passage is kind of the way that it all starts. This is where we need to be very keen. This is a warning. Look at the second clause in verse 11. It reads, "No one seeks God." Now read the first clause of verse 12. "All have turned aside." What's the difference between those two things? Between the latter part of verse 11 and the first part of verse 12. No one seeks God on one hand. All have turned aside. What's the difference? One of them is passive, right? One of them is active. It's a passive activity to not do something. It's an active activity to do something. To not seek God is passive. And all that really means, it does not mean, and this is key, for a person who's going to leave God, I don't think, in fact, I think very rarely is it walking firmly with God and staying true to God, and then just on a dime, I'm going to go the exact opposite direction. Does that happen? Strong, true in their spirit, steadfast faith. And then just out of the middle of nowhere, I think I'm going to do the exact opposite of everything that I've been doing up to this point. Does that happen very often? No, it doesn't. In fact, I've never seen that. But what does happen, and what Paul very aptly points out here, is that it begins as simply not seeking God, which means what? It means that time and energy is being filled with other stuff. It does not mean I'm going to go become a vile sinner. Not at first. It means I'm interested in this, and I want to watch this show, and I want to listen to that music, and I want to hang out with this friend group, and I'm busy this Sunday, and I'm going to be busy this Wednesday, and I'm not going to read the Bible tonight. I'm going to read this novel that's next to my bed because it's got a really exciting story. And I'm going to hang out with my friend group, and I'm just going to start skipping church more because I'm doing this other stuff. That's how it starts. And the thing that has always amazed me is that in Luke chapter 14, Jesus gives a parable specifying the manner in which the majority of people will deny him. And it is not in the way that you might think. Jesus said, "A man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servants to those who'd been invited. 'Come, everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I've bought a field and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused.' Another said, 'I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I go to examine them. Please have me excused.' And another said, 'I've married a wife and therefore I cannot come.' And at the end of the parable, Jesus said, not a single one of those people who were invited will be in my banquet. But the thing that amazes me is that none of the activities of any of the people in that parable were bad things. I'm working. I bought oxen and I need to go see them. I just got married. I need to spend time with my wife. These are all things God created for good. God made man to work. God made men and women for one another. Marriage and work are integral to life. So some of the things God made us for are some of the very things that will keep us from him. Because very often, and in fact, I would say the vast majority of the time, leaving God is not an active activity. It is a passive one. Eventually, it will become active. eventually you will start speaking badly against God and you'll work toward the opposite end. But it doesn't start that way. It starts with mere busyness. And here's what's interesting. Here in Romans 3, he mentions these people that, they don't actively seek God. So that's one thing we just talked about. But then he says they've all turned aside. Now they're going the opposite direction. And what's the thing he says just after saying they've all turned aside? What words does he use? Altogether, they have become, what word? Worthless. Very often you hear people say, we were worth it to God. We had this, we are worthy, or we have self-worth. Paul's saying, no, what we did when we left God was we became worthless, which actually makes the love of God that much greater. But interesting to the message, and the point that I want to bring out right now, is that this idea of worthlessness, the word that he uses, is a word that means depraved to the point where there is no longer anything valuable you can bring to the table, morally speaking. So what he's saying is, for the people who have left God, the very people, by the way, that are running our world, they cannot bring anything of moral value to the table. And they're running our world. We will not have true justice or mercy or the things God is desiring for us if, as a country, we say the Bible has no place. God has no place. He's on our money, but money is really our God. They have become worthless, which is why he says right after this, no one does good. You cannot do good when you're morally depraved. Now, I want to close this morning with a couple of positive spiritual directions to give to keep us anchored. I mentioned at the beginning, and this is kind of that earthy wisdom that young boys need to hear. Young boys that are not being taught to work hard, that are being taught that they can do nothing but play video games all day long, that are being taught that and young girls that are being taught they can just be on their cell phones all day long, and all the great problems that are coming out of this. This is maybe something in a former generation that wouldn't have had to been touched on. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we know that if we don't actively keep order in our lives, in the way that we physically look, say we do no exercise, we only eat badly, and we just sit all the time, what's going to happen to the cellular level of our body? Become disordered. If we don't mow our lawns, it's going to get messy. If we don't weed eat, the grass is going to grow up the fence. If we don't actively work at these things that are breaking down in our vehicles, if we don't do oil changes, what's going to happen? If we don't proactively keep order, disorder will come. Now, here's where this ties into what we're talking about here. Inactivity always leads to disorder. And the vast majority of us are pretty hard workers, able to work with our hands, able to get things done, able to produce, very smart, very intelligent, very capable, using these means that God has given us to certain ends, and we're able to produce and make an effect and, make something of value that is of worth, at least temporarily. The challenge that Paul is bringing out in this message for us is do not let your spiritual state become disordered by way of spiritual inactivity. The call is do not let your Bibles at home become dusty. Do not let your praying knees get soft. They need to be as hard as a rock because you're on them all the time. Do not let your love of the brothers wane as you, or is it wax? The world may never know. Wax is getting smaller. I remember the waxing crescent. Other way around. It was wane. Okay. Wane. Do not let your spiritual desires grow cold. This past week, I've been watching the news maybe too much. I think I might need to shut it off. It's making me a little sick to my stomach as I'm watching the kinds of stuff that's happening in our country, in this land. Injustice prevailing, violence, plans for a future for this country that are unduly ungodly. And I realize how easy it is to make our focus and make our eyes on all of this stuff. But the challenge is do not let your spiritual fervor grow cold by continually mixing yourself with the stuff that's out there. We are working and living for something else, something of eternal value. When this life comes to an end, we're going to wish we'd put more time in this stuff and less time in the other. Spiritual apathy is so easy to do. It's so easy to say, I just don't feel like reading my Bible today. I don't feel like praying today. It's so easy to say, I don't feel like fellowshipping today. I'm just going to sit on the couch because we think that will fill us better, but it won't. It never fills us better. It leaves us feeling more empty, more tired. So that's the first challenge, is not to let inactivity bring our spiritual lives to disorder. And then the other one is something that Paul brings out at the end of verse 18. Notice what he says of these people. It's kind of an instructive point. He says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, just before it, he said, the way of peace they have not known. Think about that. The way of peace they have not known. And then he says, there's no fear of God before their eyes. What connection is that? Well, the implication, if you read it logically, is that had there been a fear of God before their eyes, the way of peace they would have known, which is maybe counter to the way that we would think of it. We would think that having a fear of God would be something that would make us clam up. But by way of the connection he brings out, he's saying that having a fear of God actually does lead to peace in your life. And I'll give you an example. When you're just off the top of your head, when you're driving into Okarche, going north on 81, you're coming up to that overpass. You see that giant cross over to the right side of the road. What do you do when you get to that bridge? Every one of you, what do you do? Does your foot go on the brake pretty quick? Or is it just me? This illustration is not working too well. What is just over the other side of that bridge almost every time, right there in the middle of the median? A police officer. I know that spot very well. I get a little heart palpitation. I mean, immediate glance at my speed, foot on the brake. Why? Because Miranda and I have an agreement that if I get a ticket, it has to come out of my spending money. I don't want to spend my spending money on a ticket. So just a little bit of fear of an officer of the law makes me to stay in line. Now imagine how we would drive, and I'm not saying I do crazy speeding. I'm more like a 6-7 miles over the speed limit kind of guy. That's besides the point. But imagine how we would drive. How would we drive if we knew that there was a police officer parked every half mile? Would it change the way we drive? Would there be far less reckless driving? Would there be far fewer accidents? Would there be far less texting while driving? How much better would we obey the law if we knew there was a law enforcer somewhere everywhere? And the point that Paul's bringing out is when it comes to God, it's actually true, because there is nowhere we can go. There's nowhere we can be, even in the moments we think we're totally alone, that God is not right there with us. Having no fear of God before our eyes brings us to do the very things that should make us fear God most. But when we know God is right there, Paul does not say it will be a burden, but in fact, it will be the very thing that brings and leads to peace. So my challenge this morning is, number one, stay spiritually active. Come to this stuff. Get engaged. Jesus is coming. And the second one is conceptualize of God right there next to you, everywhere you are. Because he is. He's here right now, but he's also next to you in the car. He's everywhere that we go. Let's stand and sing.